Back in November 1965, way out in a remote valley in Vietnam, two armies squared off for the very first time in a really big way. And this clash, well, wasn't just about testing new ways to fight. It tragically set the stage for the entire next decade of the war. We're talking about the Battle of Ia Drang. So, you gotta picture the scene in the Ia Drang Valley. The question hanging in the air was, well, it was simple, but it was also incredibly profound. What happens when a brand new high-tech army clashes with a battle-hardened guerrilla force for the very first time? On one side, you had the U.S. 1st Cavalry Division, all built around this new helicopter tech. And on the other, the People's Army of Vietnam, the PAVN, guys who are veterans of a long, brutal war for their own independence. The answer to that question, unfortunately, was going to be written in blood. So, let's talk about what was going on here. For the United States, this was a huge deal. This wasn't just some random engagement. Nope, this was the first real-world test of a totally revolutionary new idea, a doctrine built around the helicopter that they truly believed was going to change warfare forever.
And that core concept had a name: air mobility. The whole idea was pretty straightforward, really. You use speed, you use technology, helicopters, to basically jump over the jungle. You could strike the enemy anywhere, anytime. And once you found them, you'd call in this massive umbrella of air power and artillery to just annihilate them from a distance. It was all about fighting from afar.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. You've got these two completely opposite ways of thinking about war crashing right into each other. The US strategy, keep your distance, use your tech, stay safe. But the PAVN, they were smart. They knew they couldn't go toe-to-toe with American firepower. So what did they do? They came up with a countermove. Get in so close, so fast, literally grab them by the belt, that the Americans couldn't use their planes and artillery without risking hitting their own guys. And believe me, this fundamental clash, it was going to define everything that came next.
All right, so the stage is set, and the very first test of these two clashing ideas. It all went down when the 1st Battalion 7th Cavalry got dropped by helicopter into this tiny little clearing right at the foot of a mountain, a place they called Landing Zone X-Ray. I mean, just look at this map. You can really get a sense of how isolated these guys were. That mountain, the Chupong Massif, was a known enemy stronghold. Landing right at its base, I mean, that's not just risky. That's basically walking up to a giant hornet's nest and giving it a good, hard kick just to see what happens. Well, they found out what happens almost immediately. The very first prisoner they captured revealed something absolutely terrifying. They thought they were facing a small, local force. The reality? The first wave of fewer than 200 American soldiers was staring down an estimated 1,600 PAVN soldiers hidden all around them in the jungle. They were surrounded and outnumbered from the get-go. What happened next was just a desperate, brutal 3-day siege. The Americans had no choice but to form this tight little circle, a 360-degree perimeter, and just hold on for dear life as wave after wave of PAVN forces crashed against their lines. It was a non-stop, absolute fight for survival. But here's the thing. The American strategy of firepower? It seemed to be working. They held their ground, and thanks to an absolutely relentless storm of airstrikes and artillery, we're even talking B-52 bombers being used in direct support for the first time ever, they inflicted just horrific casualties. The Americans walked away from X-ray claiming a staggering 10-to-1 kill ratio. So if you're sitting back at U.S. command, what does this look like? A clear, undeniable win. But the battle was far from over. Just as the exhausted survivors from LZ X-ray were being flown out, a 2nd American battalion was about to walk straight into an absolute nightmare. And this next part, it proved that the PAVN were incredibly quick learners. And this quote right here, from the PAVN commander, Colonel Nguyen Hu En, is just chilling. It tells you exactly what he learned from LZ X-ray. He realized, okay, to survive their firepower, we have to get so close it becomes useless. And he was about to put that theory into practice with devastating results. So you've got the guys from the 2nd Battalion, and they are just spent, completely exhausted. Most of them had been awake for nearly 60 hours straight. And now they get an order to march, on foot, through dangerous enemy territory to a new landing zone called Albany. You couldn't have set up a more perfect recipe for disaster. The whole battalion was stretched out in this long, thin line. Over 500 meters, they were wading through elephant grass that was literally chest high, so thick you could barely see the guy in front of you. They were tired, they were exposed, and they were completely, utterly vulnerable. And then, just like that, the trap was sprung. Hundreds of PAVN soldiers just erupted out of the grass, slamming into the side of the American column. The fight instantly dissolved into pure chaos, a complete free-for-all. This was it. This was exactly the fight the PAVN wanted, a messy, close-quarters, hand-to-hand brawl where all those helicopters and all that artillery meant absolutely nothing.
And the numbers, wow, they tell a truly shocking story. Look at this. At LZ X-ray, over 3 long days of nonstop fighting, the U.S. lost 79 men. Terrible. But then you look at LZ Albany. In just 16 hours, 155 killed. The number more than doubled in a fraction of the time. The PAVN's tactic of grabbing them by the belt, it wasn't just a theory. It was brutally, devastatingly effective.
So when all the smoke cleared and the dust finally settled, what were we left with? Well, this brutal, 2-part battle in the Ia Drang Valley had just created a grim, bloody blueprint. A blueprint that, tragically, would be followed for the rest of the war.
Here's the most critical takeaway. Both sides walked away from this thinking, our strategy works. It's wild, right? The U.S. brass looked at that 10-to-1 kill ratio from X-ray and said, see, air mobility and firepower wins. As long as the body count is in our favor, we're winning. Meanwhile, the PAVN looked at the massacre at Albany and thought, we can get in close, we can inflict huge casualties, and we can bleed these guys out over the long haul. They were both convinced they were right.
And this quote from Joseph Galloway, a journalist who was actually there on the ground during the fighting, it just hits the nail on the head. He said Ia Drang was the battle that convinced Ho Chi Minh he could win. Think about that. For the North Vietnamese, just surviving America's incredible high-tech assault was a massive strategic victory. It proved to them that they could stand up to the U.S., they could fight, and in the end, they could win.
North Vietnamese General Giap explained their thinking perfectly. He basically said, look, you Americans have tactics, these new helicopters and all this firepower. But we have a strategy, a people's war. And if we can figure out how to beat your tactics, your helicopters, then we can beat your whole strategy. And that's exactly what they believed they proved to themselves at Ia Drang.
And that leaves us with a really haunting question to think about. At Ia Drang, both sides claimed they won. But in doing so, did they just lock themselves into a brutal pattern for the next decade? One side became obsessed with technology and body counts as the measure of success. The other became convinced they could win by absorbing unimaginable losses to just bleed America dry. It was a tragic, terrible formula that guaranteed the war would be long, brutal, and incredibly costly for everyone involved.